Okay, in this video we're going to take a look at point-to-point communication links, which is essentially getting from A to B and back, which is going to be a silly little joke that we'll see in our examples. So on the agenda for the video today, we'll have a brief discussion of what a point-to-point link is, some useful properties of breaking down our communication networks into point-to-point links, or into a series of point-to-point links. And then we'll do an example of round-trip time after explaining it. So we have a point-to-point link. Very simple, right? Data originates at A and travels to B, or data originates at B and travels to A. Couldn't get much more simple than this, could it? Well, there are some, properties of these links, right? For example, in order for data to go from A to B or B to A, there must be some transmission that occurs. And the act of transmitting must take some time. Now, once that information has been transmitted, it must propagate along this link, and that must take some time. So we'll say that the transmission time is the number of bits divided by the data rate, and we'll say that the propagation time is the distance it's traveled divided by the speed in the medium. Now, this part here, speed in the medium, might seem a little bit confusing. What we're talking about is the speed of the particle that is the carrier of our information in the medium, being a wire for electronics. So, for example, electrons will travel at approximately 2.6, sometimes less, but usually about 2.6 times 10 to the 8 meters per second in a wire. And sometimes slower, of course. Whereas if this was an optic cable, we would have a photon traveling at almost 3.0 times 10 to the 8. Of course, these are idealizations, right? In reality, they will travel slower because they will have to propagate through mediums that are not vacuum or not vacuous mediums, right? In other words, they have material in here, and that material slows down the particle. But essentially, the propagation delay, or the latency, or the time to propagate, will be the distance it has to travel divided by how fast it can travel. And then, of course, perhaps A or B might do some operation, or perhaps they're compromised and take time. So the time that we assign is essentially arbitrary. We can complicate this arbitrary assignment however we please, but at the end of the day, the assignment of time to processing at each node is completely arbitrary. So we'll have T processing. And of course, these are models that are not with queues. These are the simple models. And so these are the typical types of time delays that you'll see in point-to-point links with simple models like this. So let's do an example of round-trip time. So what is round-trip time, right? Well, one-way time is the time it takes to transmit a packet of information, a message, from A to B. Round-trip time is the time it takes to transmit a packet from A to B, and that same packet from B back to A. So very simple concept. So in this example, we'll say that we have a packet size of 500 bytes, a data rate of 100 megabits per second, and we'll say that the distance between A and B, or the length of this communication link, is 1,500 meters. Okay. So we'll also say that B is infected by a rat, right, which you can go ahead and Google if you want, and it logs all incoming packets. This process takes 5 microseconds. So over here we have a representation of a packet on the wire, and this will be the size or the width of that packet on the line. This width in time units is the transmission time. So as we go along this example, we'll see it moving and being consumed at B. So finally, we're ready to start doing some work. So packet size, get this number in bits instead of bytes. So we'd have 500 times 8 bits per byte. We're left with bits. Our data rate is 100 times 10 to the 6 bits per second. Distance we don't have to touch. Well, we know that this is an electric wire because we didn't say it was optic. So we'll say that it's traveling at 2.6 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, which is a good estimate. And we know that B is infected by a rat and logs all incoming processes, so this will take 5 microseconds in additional delay. So now that we have all of our units properly converted, we can start considering calculating one-way time, the time it takes to get from A to B. Okay, so the time, the one-way time, is equal to the transmission time plus the propagation time plus the processing time. And you can see our packet's almost all the way at B. So the rate that it consumes this packet is also T-trans. So we can view the transmission time as the time it takes for all those packets to leave, or the time difference between the beginning of the packet and the end, or the time it takes for all of them to be consumed. In a queueless model, all three of these representations are okay, but it's important that you only think about it once. Either it's the time it takes to put it on the line, the time difference between the front and the end on the line, or the time to consume it off of the line. But generally, we must not count all three. So we simply count one transmission time plus one propagation delay plus one processing time at B for the infected node. Okay, so the transmission time is the size of the packet divided by the data rate plus the propagation delay, which is the distance it must travel over the speed that it will travel at. And then we'll add the arbitrary 5 microseconds for processing. So just to check that our dimensions are okay, we want units of time. So bits over seconds gives me seconds. Meters over seconds gives me seconds. So I know that this at least looks dimensionally correct. So finally we say that the one-way time is 40 microseconds plus roughly 5.8 microseconds plus 5 microseconds for processing. Now, to calculate the round-trip time, it's a little bit tricky in this situation. Remember that B only processes with 5 microseconds when it consumes packets. So the round-trip time will be the time to transmit in this direction, plus the time to propagate in this direction, plus the time to process that information, plus the time to transmit it in this direction, plus the propagation delay in this direction, giving us this as our round-trip time. In certain situations where you see store and forward switches, where you have consumption of information at both sides of the node, this will go inside that bracket and become just twice the one-way time. But in a situation like this, it's not quite so arbitrary. So the round-trip time isn't always necessarily twice the one-way time. Sometimes we have special conditions, like in this example, that make us think a little bit harder. But essentially that's the gist of it, and that's how a point-to-point transmission model works. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my tutorial. I hope it helps you, and if it did help you, please like my video and subscribe. There will be many more tutorials just like this. And until next time, farewell.